Well, good afternoon or good morning if you're in the Pacific or Asia or somewhere. So my name is Carl Binder, and this is the monthly performance thinking webinar. And I have Sara Anderson here from Insperity, and we're really looking forward to this. It's, as you, I think, know probably from the slides, and we'll get into it momentarily, this is about building a community of practice around performance thinking. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some background around performance thinking and so forth, and then that'll take a short period of time, I hope. And then Sara and I are going to have a conversation. She'll get a chance to introduce herself more and talk about Insperity. So I think I'll just put the slides up now and let's get going. And we're going to hide ourselves here because otherwise our little faces get in the way of the slides sometimes. So as I mentioned, this is building and supporting a performance thinking community practice. And most of it is going to be, without a doubt, a conversation with Sara, because Insperity has been doing this work for quite a long time. But before we get into it, I just want to do sort of the shameless commerce stuff. As probably most of you know, and I see some familiar faces here, this is getting recorded, and it will show up sometime in the next few days or next week on our YouTube channel, which is performancethinking.tv. And if you haven't checked out our YouTube channel, there's now, I can't believe it, but there's 54 recorded webinars, which means we've been doing this almost 5 years. And there's a bunch of short videos and stuff there. And also we have some free study guides, although we need to get more because we haven't done them for all the videos, but you can use that QR code to get there. And if you're watching the recording here on YouTube, you know, this is a standard, the standard content creators request, but we really would love it if you would subscribe and like and share it, because that helps us get to more people, basically. We're not making any money from this, but at least we want to get the word out. Next month, um, this is a topic that I've been sort of thinking about for a while, which is, and many of you know this because I see a lot of names of familiar folks, but the simplicity of the models in performance thinking, in particular, which not only support a community of practice, as we'll be discussing today, but they also support a kind of an easy thinking about performance in ways that give you an enormous amount of power. And if you compare this to traditional performance improvement methodologies, where there's a whole complex set of things, it's a little bit harder to, on the spur of the moment, look at a situation and come up with an insight to make an improvement. And what we've learned over the years is that there's an enormous number of ways that these models and this logic, in an even very ad hoc situation, as well as like a huge project, bring enormous amount of capability. So we're going to explore that a little bit next month. Also, we have our open performance thinking program. As many of you know, it's our performance consulting practitioner program. We do it 4 times a year as an open program. The next one starts September 15th, and there are a number of open seats still. So you can look at performancethink.com on the homepage, or you can use that QR code to find out more. And for anybody who's interested, I always like to speak with you beforehand, and either on our webpage or here, you'll be able to see a link which will allow you to find a place in my calendar to talk. But this is a program which some of you probably know. In fact, a bunch of you have been through it. But one of the things about it is we actually go through 12 weeks of instructional sessions, 12 2-hour sessions, actually twice a week, so it's 6 weeks. And then we help you select a real project in your organization and coach you through it. And those projects tend to deliver more value than the cost of the program, is what we've been told by a lot of folks. So if you're interested, there's that. Now, I'm really excited about this session today, and I hadn't thought about it in detail until Sara and I were starting to get rid of this, or get ready for this, rather. And I realized we've been partnering with Insperity since 2011, which is almost 15 years. And I have Bob Rediker's picture there. Some of you may even know Bob, but Bob is really the person who helped us start this out a long time ago. He was one of the first 2 people who was certified to deliver our performance thinking practitioner program and also our coaching program. And he was He was the person at Insperity who really took it on and brought it to Insperity. And he's retired now, but he's still a friend and a remarkable colleague and sort of wise human. And so Sarah knows him too, but I just have to include his picture. I also didn't realize until I looked more carefully that this year, Insperity was on the list of best HR outsourcing service for scaling business in 2025 from Forbes, which I thought was a pretty cool thing. So this is kind of what we want to do today. I'm going to provide you, even though most of the people, at least that I see in the list here, probably already know a fair amount about performance thinking. We're going to provide a fairly high-level overview so you kind of see what it is we're talking about here, if you're watching on the video or for those of you who don't already know about it. And then we really want to get into a conversation with Sara about the history of performance thinking at Insperity, because one of the cool things about Insperity is that they have performance specialists and performance consultants that serve both their clients and internally in their organization. And so we'll learn more about that from Sara. And then because it's been almost 15 years, there has been evolution. And again, I want to hear from Sara, and we're going to have a dialogue about how things have evolved and developed, and possibly what some of the challenges or opportunities or bumps have been, as well as possible future directions and sort of what's learned. And it'll be a pretty open-ended conversation, I think. We might go in some directions we haven't anticipated yet, but we'll see how it goes. So this is, when I thought about this, this was a way for me to summarize why I think performance thinking is able to support a community of practice in a way that's pretty powerful. Because on the left, you see the HPT, or Human Performance Technology model, and it's a model that's been part of the way the International Society of Performance Improvement talks about and represents performance improvement for many, many years. And it's a great model. I sometimes half jokingly refer to it as the everything, including the kitchen sink model, because it has a lot in there. And there's a couple of other versions of it that are even visually a little bit more complex. But when you look at that, it's not something that you can sort of, unfortunately, this word has now been used in a different way, but sort of grok things. You can't look at it and say, oh, that's how this all works. What we've done, of course, over quite a few years is we took the elements of accomplishment-based performance improvement and we turned it into the picture and the logic that we'll be talking about briefly on the right. And what I've recognized over the last few years is that the simplicity of that is a big deal, because on the one hand, it really is complete. There's nothing about performance or what influences performance that isn't represented in this framework. But on the other hand, you can look at it all at once. It's, as we often say, it's 21 plain English words and 2 simple pictures. So this is what we're going to be sort of unpacking, but I just thought visually it kind of represents how and why performance thinking is helpful. So it goes back originally in my history and in the history of this work to Tom Gilbert, because Tom Gilbert made an enormous impact in the field of performance improvement. He, like many of his contemporaries in the 60s and 70s last century, came out of the instructional design, instructional technology, instructional systems world. But as he and Gary Rumler and Dale Brethauer and some other of the early pioneering thought leaders kind of transitioned beyond just skills and knowledge, a number of them, I think, took up this same perspective. But Tom made a big deal of it in his book, Human Competence, when he said, in his usual iconoclastic way, in the great cult of behavior, and by that he meant performance improvement people, but he also meant leaders, managers, and everybody else that's trying to help people perform better. In the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. And then he said, and this is the big thing, but we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. Now, the word accomplishments in the field of performance improvement means different things to different people. And so when I started to look at it carefully, and Tom was one of my mentors, and then his probably most important protege, Joe Harless, had an even bigger influence on me. And Joe made a really big deal of being accomplishment-based. But what I recognized was, when you look at the literature of performance improvement, or you talk to colleagues, or you look at articles and so forth, the word accomplishments is used in a lot of different ways. And sometimes it's what I would call organizational level business results, like revenue or something. Other times it's small deliverables, and many times in between. So I never wanted to get in kind of arguments with people about what the word meant. So we coined this phrase work outputs, oh man, 25 years ago at least, which was intended to sort of clarify two things. One is what we're talking about here is the products of behavior, work in this case. And also notice that it's plural. So we're talking about countable things that people, individuals, teams, people working in processes, whatever, produce as a result of their behavior. And that's a big game changer when you think about performance. Now, part of that was what Gilbert talked about when he looked at interventions, whether they were training or non-training interventions. He said, the worth of an intervention is equal to the value of the accomplishments, the valuable things that the intervention increases or enables people to produce, divided by the cost to do that. And so, for example, the cliche almost instance or example of that is training, because you can do a big training program. You've spent a lot of money and time on designing and developing, and hopefully some analysis at the beginning. You roll it out. You have a lot of people take time off of work to go to the training program, and then you see what they might do differently or better on the job. And of course, sometimes it makes a big impact. But the question is, how much did it cost for all of that investment of time and money? And if you were able in some cases to say, well, instead of doing this hour-long module of training, how about if we have a really good user-tested job aid, decision table, checklist, algorithm, whatever, that we can give people, and we can set some expectations, and then their managers or supervisors can provide feedback. Maybe we could get people up to speed on producing valuable accomplishments that we care about more quickly and more cost effectively. So that was a big idea, since we've probably all been in training programs where, or other programs, other interventions where it's like, oh man, this is took a lot of time and money, but what did it pay off? And of course, in current parlance, that's return on investment. So I always come back to this because I think it's a way to think about the value of anchoring our analysis and our design of performance interventions to accomplishments. Now, this is the first model that we started to use years ago. We call it the performance chain. And what we say is, as you can see, it's behavior influences, which is all kinds of stuff in the environment or in one's self, supports or gets in the way of behavior, which is activity, tasks, and tactics. And that behavior hopefully produces work outputs or accomplishments that meet certain standards. In other words, they meet criteria, as it says, for good ones. And if they're valuable because they contribute to organizational level business results. So that's a very simple model. And what it says that there's really only three elements in performance: behavior, work outputs, and organizational results. And that there's all the stuff, behavior influences that support or get in the way of that. And it works from left to right, and it you analyze it from right to left. So that's the first thing. And we anchor this always in work outputs because that's the value. So that's a big part of this performance thinking thing. And then, of course, the list of behavior influences can get very long. It depends what workshops, books, seminars, you name it, e-learning you've gone to recently. So that list is just, my silly joke used to be, this list could go from here to the next county, depending what you've read recently. So what we did is we took from Tom Gilbert, his model, which evolved from B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner, the behavior scientist, had this, what he called the three-term contingency, where he said discriminative stimuli, or SD, set the occasion for responses that hopefully are followed by reinforcing stimuli. Well, Tom recognized that in the world of work, it's not quite that simple. We're not pigeons and rats in a Skinner box. We are people in a very complex environment, and we're all different. So he turned that into his behavior engineering model, which is very famous and it's been around for a really long time. And it says there's sort of two levels. There's the things that the environment provides to the performer, and there's the things that the person either brings to the table or needs to be given, like, for example, knowledge. And so he turned this into 6 cells and roughly aligned in those 3 columns of information that either, he's called it data, that the environment gives you, or knowledge is the way he talked about it, information you sort of carry around with you if you learn this information. And then instruments, which were the tools, the enablers of responding as you worked. And then capacity was how well suited you are as an individual for this kind of work. Are you analytical enough for this job, or strong enough, or you have the right background, et cetera. And then the consequences, well, motivation was about incentives, which is a word he used for consequences. And also, we wanted to know if people cared about those incentives, because if they didn't, to use Skinner's way of thinking, they wouldn't really be reinforcers. So motives were very important. So this was Tom's model, and most of the people in this list have encountered it probably for maybe decades. I encountered it in about 1980, and then I met Tom, and it was brilliant. And my colleagues and I really got into it. But what we learned was, when we started to try to partner with stakeholders, and most of you know this story, we heard people saying, well, what do you mean data? Like, what kind of data is that? Is that spreadsheets or databases, or what is that? Oh, well, it's the information you need to know what you're supposed to do and how you do it, or instruments. That's a funny word. What does that mean? So we started, like many of the people in the 80s and 90s, started to tweak the language of that model. And over several years of trying stuff and explicitly user testing it, we came up with, of course, what we now call the 6 boxes model. And we expanded the language, we tested it, and what we learned was that people don't make many mistakes, that you can introduce this pretty quickly to people, and they don't make category errors. And so it's very useful. And it also doesn't seem to be jargon in any way. You can talk to a senior executive about expectations, and she or he don't think that you're talking some sort of performance thinking geeky jargon. They just think you're talking about expectations. And the same thing goes for most of these words, that people sort of get them. And so it's not, the language doesn't get in the way. Now, if you want to know more about it, that QR code will get you to a webinar. So that's our second model. And it was, and I always say I don't want to make too big of a deal of this, because this was just a session at the International Society for Performance Improvement in the annual conference in 2022. But the people in that room, that a colleague of mine assembled, and Scott Wirsing, I didn't even know the session was going to happen until afterwards. They nominated and voted, and they said the 6 boxes model was the best performance model in the world. Now, I don't know if it's the best performance in the model in the world, but that gives us some confidence that people like it and find it useful. And it's important to point out about this model that it's not just a list of 6, or a thing of 6 lists. These categories are completely interactive. It is a system. So expectations only keep working if there's consequences to fulfilling those expectations, or if there's feedback that aligns with it. If you set expectations and don't give people the tools and resources they need, they're not going to make contact with the natural positive consequences. If you give people a new tool, they may need to have skills to use that tool. Or if you do something like give people a job aid, which is a tool, they may develop skills by using that. So these are categories, but they are all interactive. They intersect. They're a system. And once you have these 2 models, these very simple models, and if you count them, there's 21 plain English words, you can glue them together, so to speak, and you can offer a logic, which is what we call performance improvement or performance thinking logic. So first of all, even in an informal conversation with somebody you might be coaching, or in a meeting where you're trying to talk about some intervention or project, you say, why are we doing this again? Like, what are the business results? What's at stake here? So you want to be clear about that. And once you are, then the really important part is to nail down what the work outputs are of the individual role, of each step in a process, of a team. But what are the things of value that we're talking about here and trying to optimize? And are we sure they contribute to business results, which is what that little oval is about? Once we know that, it's pretty straightforward to figure out what the behavior is. We can do task analysis. We can observe successful people. We can observe super successful, like superstars, and do exemplary behavior analysis. But we know what the behavior is supposed to be, because it's behavior that's supposed to produce those work outputs. That's how you know you were successful. And that is a big differentiator between an accomplishment-based approach, which this is an example of that, where you know what you're trying to produce, versus one where people say, well, I think you should ask a lot of open-ended questions. And you say, well, why? Oh, because you're trying to get a list of customer needs, or what is it? So the next step in the logic is behavior. And then once you have those three elements of performance identified, that's the domains in which you can measure stuff. So you can capture, you can find out what data are available in the environment, or you can add some data catchers. Business results are going to be lagging indicators, so you don't get many data points, and so you need that information, but it doesn't let you make too many decisions very often. Behavior is really important in a lot of settings, like safety environments or following procedures exactly. It's important to observe and actually monitor behavior, but it's expensive to do so. But work outputs or accomplishments, if they meet criteria, you can count them. So actually, it's a highly underutilized, in many instances, thing that you can measure. In any event, that gives us our domain for measurement. And once we know that, now we can look at the behavior influences, and we can interview and observe people, and we can start out by analyzing and saying, okay, for this hunk of behavior to produce this work output, uh, how are those expectations working for you? Are they clear? Or are there no expectations? Or are there conflicting expectations? What are the sources of them? Does your boss tell you the same thing as the VP did at the meeting last week? Do they all line up? Same with feedback, et cetera. So you can go through the 6 boxes and you can analyze what's working, what's not working, and what's missing. Or if you're doing some new thing that's never been done before, then you can at least have a first draft of what are all the behavior influences across the 6 boxes that you're going to try to put in place, knowing you'll probably need to make changes. And then once you do that, you can brainstorm. If you're trying to improve things and you find out what's going on now in terms of behavior influences for that hunk of behavior to produce a given output, you can then say, oh, wait a minute, we could try this. We could also add a job aid. Maybe if we checked in once a week on this particular thing for a few weeks and gave you feedback, that would be helpful. Maybe if we sent you over to follow Mary for a couple hours, you'd be able to see how a real expert does this, et cetera. So you can brainstorm possible interventions. And we really encourage people to do that instead of going to just the usual suspects. And then ideally with your stakeholders, your colleagues, your clients, your performers, whoever they are, you choose the behavior influences in a way that optimizes them across the 6 boxes with the intention of having the greatest return on investment. Then you can implement and you can measure, and you'll almost always have to adjust if your organization or if your context allows you to make changes, because you almost never get it 100% right the first time. And then we always say, and this sort of is getting to the community of practice point, what we always say is you can then also share this language and models with people. So it works across any level. We found front end, high school educated, small manufacturing staff people able to understand this stuff and work with it. We've had senior executives and everybody in between. And this, you don't even need to be able to read it exactly, but this is a whole lot of different applications by a whole lot of different levels where performance thinking is useful. So, and we can even drive talent development with this approach all the way from recruitment to ongoing development. And if you want to know more about how we think about that, there was an article we published a little over a year ago that you could get to with that QR code. So the story we have here that we think, and we'll find out what Sara has to say about it, is we think the simplicity of this allows communication and collaboration to happen more readily and to build a community of practice. And so at this point, I want to ask Sara to appear on the screen, and we'll probably get rid of the slides in a couple minutes. But Sara, first of all, could you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then maybe at a high level, talk a little bit about Insperity?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a senior performance consultant at Insperity. I've been here for about 17 and a half years. I think I might make a career out of it. I don't know. Great organization, but I got into performance consulting when I actually came to Insperity. My background was in human resources as a HR business partner or HR manager in different organizations and industries. So when I came to Insperity, I actually was working as an HR specialist with our clients. So I was in a client-facing role, and then transitioned over time about let's see, about 12 years ago into a performance consultant role and working internally in the organization.
Fantastic. And so we can probably turn off the slide in a minute, but this you gave me this slide, and I thought it was a pretty interesting little picture of how the company has evolved at a high level. Because when I started working with them, they were admin staff. I remember that the other day.
Yes, exactly. That's how we were founded. And one of the challenges we encountered over the years was that people thought we were a staffing company, which we are not. We are a PEO, a professional employer organization.
And so let me stop the slides, and we can just be present here. Let me put myself back on.
Sure.
So if we take that and tell me a little bit about, first of all, what a PEO means, and sort of what the scope of business is at Insperity, and also, well, that's just hear about that, because I want to understand more about what you guys do altogether.
Yeah. So PEO, like I said, is a professional employer organization, which means that we have co-employment responsibility with our clients. So there's a risk sharing model is what's happening there. And we help our clients with compliance, and that's a big thing. So what our primary focus is providing human resources, assets, providing payroll and benefits. And so we support small to very large organizations. Our sweet spot is the small to medium sized businesses, but we are growing significantly on the larger end as well, which is really exciting to see. Mhm.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. I always knew about the small to medium size. I also know you recently have a relationship, I think, with Workday, the online system. So that's probably getting into some big places, I would guess.
Yes, it is a tremendous partnership and really exciting for us to provide that opportunity for our clients in the very near future.
So how did performance improvement, because you've been there for quite a while, so you were there, well, you were there a little bit before we got involved, but
Yeah.
in performance thinking, but Bob was there, I know. And when I met him in something like 2010, I
Mhm.
was impressed at two levels. One is Bob was a really experienced and wise performance improvement guy who had a lot of background, especially with Gary Rumler's work and some other stuff. The other thing that just blew my mind about Bob Redeker was very often when I meet senior performance people, and they want to have a conversation, they will tell me all the stuff they know. Well, with I'll never forget this. The first conversation I ever had with Bob, he started telling me how he had been sort of playing with our models a little bit and some of the things he tried to do with them. So that his level of humility was stunning. And over the time that we worked, I learned a lot from Bob. But so how did performance improvement as a thing evolve at Insperity?
So, gosh, I would guess it was probably around 2008, 2009, somewhere in that time frame, that Insperity as an organization, we're always evolving and growing, and they really wanted to move away from a training mindset for our professionals and into performance improvement. And it was right at the time that was happening that Bob was introduced to the organization. He was actually working for another company and selling a product to us at that time relevant to training, learning, and performance. And so it worked out great. They brought him in, and he was able to partner with one of the leaders in that group who had very much that interest in helping us make that transition, have more depth and breadth to the work. And they both, I think, were introduced to performance thinking through ISPI,
Right.
and that's where they were able to bring it in. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I got involved in ISPI in the mid '80s, I think, and that's really it's a very small organization now, but at that time that was robust, and there were all these thought leaders that were alive, and you could go talk to them at the conferences and such. But I'm also struck by what you just said that, you know, an awful lot of HR and training organizations, it's like, no, we don't want to mess with this other stuff. We're just doing training. So to me, it's kind of impressive that senior folks at the organization said, no, we want to get outside what I would call the training box.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that has appealed to me about Insperity is that it's a learning organization. And we are always looking for ways to bring value to our clients. And I think that really speaks to it. When our performance professionals are working with clients in the field, it's amazing the results that they get and the experiences that they have. And then that really helps them to truly see the value of the partnership with Insperity.
Well, that's cool. So I know you have performance consultants, or I don't remember the title, performance specialists, both internally in your organization and also that serve your clients. So can you talk about that a little bit and what they each do and anything else that's relevant to those two
Yeah.
different groups?
So we have multiple performance professional titles within the organization, but you're exactly right that we kind of differentiate them into two different groups. So we have those that are internal, and we have those that are what we would call external or client facing. The work overlaps, so it's a lot of the same types of things, the same types of challenges that leaders encounter where it's appropriate to apply performance thinking. I think the biggest differentiator is that internally, our performance consultants have more opportunities to do a deep dive into performance thinking so they can kind of do full Monty type projects, right? Like everything. And they really get that opportunity to follow up with the internal client, to check in on measurement, to make refinements. So there's a tighter collaboration, I think, that happens more naturally internally. Externally with our clients, they don't always have that capacity to engage with us that way. So, we have to meet them where they are and provide service in a way that's going to work best for them in that moment. So, for our performance specialists in the field, they don't always get to do full-blown projects, but they do have lots of opportunities still to apply performance thinking.
So there's two things that what you just said remind me of. One of it is that somebody working with one of your clients can say, you know, we do this back home too. And to me, that's a credibility factor. If you're saying, well, we're going to bring you these programs, we don't actually use them, you know, but we think they're pretty cool and we're going to sell them to you. That's not it. It's so, and especially if what you're describing, if you have a community of practice where there's learning going back and forth between your internally focused. And so to me, that's a really cool feature of all this. But the other thing I'm struck by is when you mention with your clients, you know, people don't get to do full on projects quite often. One of the things that I believe strongly, and I've experienced this myself, and we've got a few other companies that, I mean, so how many folks have gone through our performance consulting practitioner program at Insperity, roughly?
We've had over 100 people that have
That's what I
gone through the
thought.
program here. Yeah, quite a lot.
And so the only other company that, well, we've had a couple others, but the only other current one that's really big is Amgen, and they started about the same time as you guys did, and they're a bigger company. Last I heard, they have something like 40,000 employees, and they've certified or had at least gone through the program something like 350 people. But what I know from them and from a lot of our colleagues who've been doing this work for years, and also from my own experience, is that probably only 20 to 30% of a person's work anyway is going to be big projects. And the thing I love about, I mean, it sounds arrogant for me to be saying this about my company's own thing, but one of the things I love about performance thinking is because of the simplicity of it and the sort of it's all there in one set of pictures, you can do ad hoc stuff, right? You can be in a meeting and people are saying, well, we have these two jobs and these people are like stepping on each other's toes and I don't know what we're going to do about it. If you say, well, have you looked at the expected accomplishments of these two different roles? Maybe there's some redundancy here. Maybe we could clarify this. Or people say, well, our people are really upset about da 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 da. And you say, oh, well, how's expectations working for them? Are they consistent from the top down? And so you can pull pieces out of the models and apply them in the moment because you think that way. So I would think that would lend a lot of value to the externally focused people. That makes sense?
100%. And that's exactly how it's showing up for them. Yeah.
So what are some of the examples? You were talking about amazing results. I'm curious if you can talk about any of the kinds of things that people have done.
I probably have to be mindful of
Understood.
disclosing client things, but we, for example, had a client one time that they had they provide a service with a particular product that was manufactured elsewhere, and they had
Mhm.
opted to bring manufacturing on site, to bring it in-house for them.
Mhm.
And so the performance specialist that was working with them at the time was able to use performance thinking with that client and really help them plan for
Nice.
an effective implementation of that in-house manufacturing. And that was
That's
a
really cool.
great example. Yeah.
Did they like map the processes and stuff for manufacturing? Was that where they started, or how did that work?
I
You know?
don't know that she got granular into their process mapping with it,
Fair
but she
enough.
was able to use the model, of course, to help them think through from a change perspective and
Yeah.
implementing this manufacturing component into their world,
Mhm.
what that needed to look like.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because you just reminded me of the fact that when I first encountered Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model, actually my first area of application was implementing programs. And it was actually implementing training programs in a way. We were working with salespeople we were trying to rapidly develop very fluent verbal repertoires uh, that they would use in their sales process, and they needed to practice outside of class. Class was a tiny bit of that we had gave them tools, and they really need to kind of do some a few minutes of practice every day for in between sessions of training. And the only way you could get that to happen was to arrange some conditions out there in the job where,
Yeah.
the manager would say, "Well, how's that going?" And maybe ask them some questions and getting a conversation going and feedback and stuff. And so I think what I learned was that the six boxes thing provides you with an implementation planning framework to put conditions in place. So that sounds maybe parallel. They say, "Well, how are we going to get this manufacturing thing to happen here?" Right?
Yeah,
That's a
exactly.
great example. Um, so let's see, what else is one of the things. So you've been doing this for like 12, something like 15 years almost.
Mhm.
What's um, the other thing that occurs to me is that probably your externally facing people may have more requests than they can handle because you got a lot of clients and there's not a bazillion. Is that true?
Oh, yeah,
So
absolutely.
how do they? Is it just what client shouts the most, or how do they decide who they're going to work with and what they're going to work on?
Well, they do have an assigned book of business. So they
Mhm,
have particular set of clients that they are assigned to.
mhm,
But at any time, if those folks that are working in the field with the clients feel they don't have the capacity to handle the requests that are coming in, they
mhm.
have the network with their peers that they can reach out and get that assistance. So,
Yeah. Okay.
inevitably somebody's going to have that capacity to be able to support
Okay.
them. And that's one
Oh,
of the
that
nice
makes
things
sense.
about using performance thinking. When we think about bringing that to the organization and these folks that are servicing different clients, it's not always that it's a they don't have the bandwidth or the capacity to handle the request. Sometimes those clients move on to another service team, and so they've grown to a point where they move structurally within our organization to another group, and there may be a project that's going along with it. And so having that structure, that community of practice within Insperity, allows clients to move more smoothly to another provider
Um,
because they can
yeah.
understand the notes, they understand the work that has already been done.
Yeah, it's a vocabulary thing. One of the things that strikes me, and I want to talk more about how your folks share, because that's clearly what we mean by community of practice. But
Yeah.
what I'm reminded of is when I have a lot of colleagues who are pretty senior performance consultants all over the world, right? And most of them have learned a whole lot of different methodologies and a whole lot of tools, and they get involved in some project and they sort of pull this tool out of their portfolio or that one or this one or the other one, and they're smart and really capable. But if you wanted to replicate them, or if you wanted to have a whole team of people doing stuff, it'd be pretty hard because everybody kind of has their favorites and everything. And again, it may be a little arrogant for me to say that, but I think that the framework of performance thinking allows you to do almost any of that stuff with a shared vocabulary. So that I never thought about that one, the handoff thing. That's a big deal. So how much work do you all do internally to keep people learning with and from each other, the performance improvement folks? And how do you do that?
Yeah. So, we ran into challenges, of course, when Bob retired.
Yeah, I bet.
He has been a great mentor to me, a wonderful friend. But yeah, so that was a little bit difficult when he retired to make that full transition. It's been a couple of years now, so I think we're in a better place. But we use heavily Microsoft Teams. We connect through that. So we have channels that are set up specifically for practitioners, and we engage in different ways. One of the big, evolutions of our community of practice this year was implementing office hours. So every week for an hour, go live. And people can pop in, ask whatever questions they have. There's no hard, fast rules around it. So the expectations are show up when you want and when you can, and show up how you need to. So sometimes people will join with their cameras off. They're just listening because they're working in the background. But sometimes people come in. We had one on Monday, and somebody came in, an internal person that was dealing with a challenge, and they were seeking some support with that. And it was great. And we pulled up a virtual whiteboard, and we started going through the performance chain and helping her resolve and figure out what her next steps were. What were those next questions that she needed to ask? What kind of data did she need to go and collect? And it's a lot of fun. People love to solve problems. They love to help each other out. And especially at our organization, we hire specifically for that, right? That mindset of wanting to help. And so when they come to office hours and we have a session like that, it's great. They don't always come with questions. Sometimes I have office hours that's just people came to listen. So we pull out funny things, things that they connect to, from a pop culture or something like that. So last week we did a virtual whiteboard, and we did a whole performance chain for Dexter. I don't know if you watched that TV show with the gentleman, but somebody had started talking about it. So let's do a performance chain on Dexter.
God.
And we had just the greatest time, but it's something that folks are connecting to.
Yep.
And then they're asking those important questions, because then they're starting to make connections, whether it's Dexter or it's a real situation here at Insperity. They're connecting to that content, and it's lighting a fire in their brain. So it's fun.
It's really cool. That's a great example. One of the things I've been struck by is I've worked, because one of the things we sometimes do, we did this early on with Insperity, of course. If we have a group that I'm facilitating a certification program that's all from the same company, is 8 to 12 people typically, and a lot of times they have very different kinds of projects, and there might be one person who has like a really focus on some processes and they're trying to optimize performance in the process. There may be some other people who are working on a role to define it better, to support it so that they can hire and support the better. Now those are pretty different. They're all about starting with the business results and identifying the outputs and all that, but having those people who have different examples and experiences come together and share that. Like when we do project coaching sessions, typically there's 3 or 4 projects being discussed in a couple hours. And, in any given half hour in there, everybody but one is mostly being quiet. And I always ask people, like, is this useful for you to be in there? And they say, oh, yeah, because I'm learning all this stuff about what she's doing. And so my bet is that it's a rich, especially given that you said early on that Insperity is a learning organization. This has got to be quite a robust, even if you only got to have a few people in the room, opportunity for people to learn from each other.
Yes, and I think what you just said there is so powerful that when we have office hours, it's not like you're coming to class and someone's lecturing you.
Right.
People are learning from each other's experiences and, and they're sharing.
Mhm.
That's one of the ways that we've been able to get people to share.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the challenges that Bob and I have had over the years is people will do great, it's either a certification project or we're coaching them through a project afterwards, and they will have a great project and we're so excited about it. And we'll say, oh, would you be willing to do a lunch and learn and just kind of walk people through your project? And they tend to shy away from that. But when we do office hours and someone's asking for help, that's where
Mhm.
we get people saying, "Oh, well, I want to share with you something that I did that's similar. So let me show,
Nice.
let me tell." And I think those are opportunities for people to increase their confidence as well and know that, yeah, you got it.
That's really interesting. I've had that same experience in another context because a lot of times people do certification projects that are just stunning. And I'll say, would you be willing to like put together a PowerPoint deck and like let me record that so I can share it with people in future programs? And a lot of times they'll say yes, but they're busy and they maybe
Yeah.
don't want to be, the center of attention. But what you just described is almost like a sneaky way of getting to say, wait a minute, I've done something like that. That's very cool. I like that. Um,
Yeah.
one other thing I was thinking about sharing across folks. Oh, are there regulars? Are there among your community? Are there people that are sort of always there, and some people that never are? That's how it usually works with me. But I wondered.
Yeah, I've got a couple that are very consistent. They miss one once in a while, but for the most part
Mhm.
show up. I do offer them different days of the week and different times of the day, just so that those that have standing meetings don't consistently miss out.
Mhm.
And so that can sometimes, I think, play into their ability to attend. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's
You,
good.
you mentioned that Teams is a big thing there. So if I've got it right, I've not worked in an environment myself where Teams was the thing, but that's sort of an evolution. Part of that was what used to be SharePoint, right? You can set up a okay. So one of my
Yes.
questions is when people do projects, do they ever put documents up there that I can go check out how Mary did X, Y, and Z? Is that encouraged or possible there?
We invite it and encourage it. Um, when people get that confidence and comfort with sharing, I will
Mhm.
let you know.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right, fair
that's
enough.
a barrier for us to overcome.
Well, yeah, I think it is. And, a big part of it is reinforcement. It's like, hey, these three people put some stuff up on SharePoint last month. This is fantastic. Thank you. That level of celebratory stuff can help sometimes, just a box three thing. But the other thing, of course, is, in our program, we have this simple project planning tool. And what I always tell people when we're coaching them is first reason I ask you to do it is because when I'm coaching you, I can't remember all the bazillion projects I'm coaching at any given time. So I can really quickly read through your little Word document and say, oh, okay, I remember this. Let's go. But the other thing is, I'm always thinking both for colleagues, but even, a year later, you do some project, and then a year later, you find something that's kind of similar, and you say, oh, how did we do that back there anyway? And so for me, having some simple form of documentation would be awfully wonderful to be able to put in place. But I get that people may not want to do it. But that seems like a big potential, at least, if you could make it simple, but there. So even knowing, like I've been in knowledge management settings before, where somebody posts something, and then it's very easy to reach out to that person and ask them a question.
Yeah.
And the question would be, is there's a way, and I wonder if anybody who's participating here, and we'll have stop in a few minutes and we can see if they have suggestions, but I wonder if anybody's been in a community of practice setting where they've successfully done this, where people don't necessarily show up at meetings, but they somehow post stuff so that they at least know who else is working on things. Let's see what else I might ask you. I guess one of the things is, um, I always talk about aha moments, like I'm looking for the light bulbs to go off. And my assumption is you've been doing this for a long time now. If you were going to pass this on to some other company that was trying to establish performance consulting, performance thinking, community practice. What are some of the real important insights you would bring to that, you would recommend?
I think if somebody were intentionally developing a community of practice, I think one, don't make any assumptions about how people will interact. So, hear from those people that will be part of that community, get their input. You don't have to know everything, and you don't have to design it in a way that you think is going to be
Right.
effective. And I think, too, what's really important is if you are in a matrixed organization or an organization that is based on the product or the service and not by function, consider those stakeholders. Think about the leaders of those individuals and how they're going to enable their participation in that community of practice, how they'll reinforce it, and what their vision is for how performance thinking is used in their department, in their part of the organization. So, doing a good stakeholder analysis, bringing those people into the conversation and talking about how they'll support it, because it's not just, you as an individual arranging it and managing it.
So do you have at Insperity some sort of relatively senior kind of business leaders or operational leaders who are kind of bought into performance thinking and support it a little bit in the way you were just describing?
Yes, we're very lucky here. And I think because performance thinking has been our way of working for so long. The VP for my division came in as a performance consultant and reported to Bob. So she's an advocate for it. Our director out in the field, they are advocate for it. Our managing director. So we've recently, kind of reorganized our performance folks in the field so that they have one distinct line of leadership, which is really empowering for them and is wonderful. She's a great advocate for it. So we've got a tremendous amount of support within our leadership group. And it is because they carve out the time for people to come to class and to get certified. They carve out time for people to attend our lunch and learns or our mini refreshers and things like that. So we really appreciate their reinforcement.
That reminds me of two things, and then we should probably see if people have anything to say. By the way, folks, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat box, and then we can address them. But what I was going to say is it reminds me of a couple things. One is in large organizations where we've brought performance thinking in, like what you're saying, it makes an enormous impact to have one or more senior leaders who say, this is important, we're going to do this. Bill Blunt, who is also retired, but who brought performance thinking into Amgen around the same time Bob was getting going, he talked about a viral approach. And his viral approach was, somebody'd ask him for something, they asked for training, and he'd go in and say, yeah, but there's some other stuff too. And they might or might not say, okay, just do the training, Bill, and we'll handle the rest. And then, of course, they wouldn't necessarily. And so they might even ask him back and say, hey, could you come back and tell us about some of that stuff, other things you were talking about? But however it worked, what would happen is if he did some project or some work for some business leader, and the business leader would come to him and say, oh, this is great, Bill, this is fantastic. He would say, don't tell me, tell your peers. And I thought it was an obvious but brilliant thing, really. So I don't know if that happens in Insperity, but I thought that was important.
It does, actually. We've had departments within our organization that have come directly to Bob or to our group seeking out performance thinking certification for their folks because they were involved in something else. They heard about it, they saw it in action and said, that will work with our group, and we need to do
That's
that.
cool. Well, when we try to recruit people into our practitioner program, I often reach out to senior leaders and say, send one of your smarty pants lieutenants or whatever, assistant or somebody that'll help you get stuff done. The other thing I was reminded of, the viral thing and something else you said, if I can't remember it, I should have noted it down, but that's okay. But I think the whole thing of building it, it's not just us performance thinkers, it's the it's the leadership and it's the operations people. Because the other cool thing about these models is so often when I've first met a client, like a VP of something, and I said, well, let me show you a little bit how we think. And so, can I use your whiteboard, if we're in a room? And I'll just draw out the performance chain in the 6 boxes. And they don't say, like, They say, oh, that makes sense. And so,
Yes,
it's kind of an easy communication thing with them sometimes, too.
absolutely. Yeah.
So, I'm looking at the chat box here, and Chris says hi from Wilson. And then Erwin, I told you he would be a contributor. Erwin, you always say something good. He says, which performance consulting skills do you find the most difficult for folks to learn? That's an interesting question.
Oh, wow. Honestly, I think when I look back over the last few years, I think probably what is honestly most challenging is really about interviewing. It is knowing the next question to ask, knowing that probing question that's going to get you the information that you're really seeking, and even just getting that practice with asking questions in a way that makes sense to the client, so that you don't feel robotic and static
Right.
in using the model.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I've always felt in my own experience, but I've been doing this for so long, who knows what it was like in the beginning? I can't remember, but I've always found, for example, the 6 boxes model, just as a thing, helps the communication because you can say, well, let's talk about all this stuff, starting with expectations. Like, how do you guys set expectations around here? How do you receive them? And at least the models can direct some of those questions in a fairly easy way. But the skill of actually saying it and knowing how direct it to be and all that that's a big deal. That's interesting. I'm looking at Chris's comment. Chris Lewis says, communities of practice are such an important part of learning organizations. Excellent way to provide a safe environment. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not so much a question, but yeah, that's a big deal. And the pillar leads. So I'm curious, Chris, when you talk about pillar leads, do you mean parts of sort of segments within the community, or I'm curious what that means? Pillar leads. Well, you don't have to respond, but that makes me ask another question. Well, is there anything else? It seems like you have a community of practices such that it's not completely self-sustaining because of some of the things you were just saying. Do you have anything like a subgroup who function almost like a steering committee or anything like that? Or are your conversations even in your office hours ever? How can we make more of our colleagues come into this, or in other words, about the community of practice itself? Has that ever been part of the conversation?
It really hasn't, but I think there's absolutely an opportunity for that. So you've got my wheels spinning a little bit now, thinking about, maybe there's an opportunity for us there to engage a little bit more with folks.
Because we're trying to do that also. We, at various points, have done our monthly open meetings for certified people. And the last 6 months, we've sort of let that slide, partly because my former senior associate, is now not working with us anymore, and he was sort of managing that. But we've been trying to really get people involved in a way. In fact, a few Insperity people have been among the stars in that group because they come with both ideas but good questions. And I guess I know what I was going to say. I'm sorry, this is a bit of a switch. But you were talking about folks enabling, being sure that folks could go to the practitioner program and stuff like that. One of the biggest insights that I've seen from a leader was a director guy at a high-tech company who he wanted the managers that reported to him to be continuously developing their people. And what he said is, I'd like you to spend about 10% of your time developing your team members. And if you have a hard time doing that because you don't have enough time, come to me and I'll help you reset your priorities. Now, when I heard that, it blew my mind because you probably have seen just as many cases where people say, well, just do it. You got to work on the weekends or evenings or whatever it is. But the recognition that time is a resource, and that we can manage it so people can actually do things well, I think is a big deal. So that's what I was reminded of.
You're absolutely right about that.
Anyway, it looks to me, so Chris said, yes, that's right. So I think probably we're at the end of our hour, and I really appreciate your sharing what's going on in Insperity. And to be continued maybe, but thank you very much. And thanks everyone for showing up, and come back next month. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl.
Bye-bye. So thank you, Sarah. This has been quite an interesting conversation for me. I want to summarize some of what we just said in some key points, just so people can take away these points. It's kind of ground level assertion on our part, but I think what we just talked about illustrate that this performance thinking approach is a very powerful, very flexible, and relatively easy to communicate framework for anybody doing performance improvement. And the kind of community that you guys have built, not only within the organization, but with your clients, the communication factor is a big deal. The plain English models also allow collaboration in a way that's unique. And I think you shared some examples for that, because you talked about business leaders who even request them to have certified practitioners in their organization. We talked about support from people who are not HR performance people, but we also talked about people learning from one another, performance professionals learning from one another, and then also in your client organizations. So there's this network that in some ways Insperity is uniquely positioned to optimize, of people working to improve performance formally and informally across a bunch of organizations and levels, where the plain Englishness and the simplicity of these models makes a difference and allows for greater collaboration. I also think you shared some examples of how basically having a community like this strengthens the individuals through collective learning. So to me, your office hours are a great example of that, where you bring people together. They may or may not show up, but if some do, they learn from one another. They share stories and examples and insights. And so that's an ongoing collective learning thing, which to me is at the heart of what it means to have a community of practice. There's also a certain viral dimension to this, and I think I mentioned this more in relationship to another large adopter of performance thinking, the biotech company. But I think also some of what you described could be thought of as kind of viral, because people, especially given how long you've been doing this, are continually learning from one another in the shared vocabulary and such, almost whether they like it or not. That's probably kind of an excessive statement, but there's a certain quality that becomes part of the DNA. And so that's a huge opportunity to build kind of an organic community of practice. And then another point that I said a few times, and then you, Sarah, you confirmed, which is that a lot of the people who learn performance thinking, because of the simplicity and the plain Englishness of it, they can do big projects, and they often do. But also, especially in your client companies, they may wind up doing much more ad hoc, in the moment, bringing insights to solve problems that don't require a whole project, but maybe require clarification of expectations, or consistent arrangement of consequences, or being really clear what's expected of the accomplishments of a given role or a process. And so there's an awful lot of opportunities where the simplicity of the models in performance thinking allow people to, in the moment, think through stuff. They don't have to go through a whole complex analysis process. And then I think we could say, for everybody who is in this webinar, but also for the community of practice you all have built, we're all still learning from this. And to me, that's a big part of it. So those are at least some of the takeaways I think that are important. And then finally, I want to just show you and remind you of some resources. Our website at performancethinking.com has a bunch of stuff on it. You can register for the next webinar there. We do have a resource library that has some publications and white papers and such. And there's even a blog, which we have not done much with for a while, but has some pretty interesting pieces on it that are of some permanent value, I think. And then, of course, the YouTube channel at performancethinking.tv, which has, I continue to be amazed, but with this one, it'll have had 55 recorded webinars, plus a lot of other presentations and short playlists and such. And then we do have a LinkedIn group, and you can find it if you look for Performance Thinking Network on LinkedIn. And a lot of times it's not very active. A lot of times it's just ads that we put out, or notices for the upcoming open program. But on the other hand, people ask a question. There's some smart people that will get those messages sometimes, and you'll get some interesting responses at times. And then finally, on Facebook, we have a page. It's specifically for applied behavior analysis people using performance thinking, but it does exist, and it's a place, again, where you can potentially have a virtual community of practice. So I just want to thank everyone and appreciate everybody's participation.